We can now bring in Elisa Catalano Ewers, Senior Fellow for Middle East Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you so much for joining us on the program today. I was just wondering if you could hear our correspondent from Jerusalem earlier. She said that now the Israeli plan is to bring about regime change in Iran by essentially knocking out the structure of the Islamic Republic. Do you share that assessment?
Thank you for having me. I believe that there's a moment of opportunity here in the eyes of the Israeli leadership and the Israeli Defense Forces to create as much of a crisis in the regime leadership structure in Iran as possible. And so, given the opportunity and the ability to target individuals in the leadership structure, I think they are taking those opportunities when they present themselves. The real question is, what is the tipping point from that crisis that potentially leads to regime collapse? I think so far the regime has been able to withstand the pressure. There's still resistance. There is still decision making, and consolidation amongst the security apparatus still appears to be the case. But I think we have to question our assumptions about how much of this kind of targeting the regime can withstand before we see the kinds of cracks that the Israelis are trying to produce.
But Elisa, what I find difficult to understand is that the Americans and the Israelis have been calling on Iranians to come out to the streets. But of course, these cities are still being bombed. As you heard a Nogar correspondent say earlier, there were reports, again, fuel depots have been targeted. If Iranians who are even against the regime are going to see this sort of thing happen, there's going to be a rally around the flag, won't they, even in the short term?
Well, I think it's impossible to expect the Iranian population to come out under such expanded targeting throughout the country, including in urban areas. And unfortunately, I think it's the Iranian people who have been kind of relegated to the bottom of the priority list. As we've heard the Trump administration and the government in Israel articulate goals and objectives for this war over the last 18 days, the ability to enable the Iranian people has kind of fallen down the list. And so this idea that they could come out into the streets under these circumstances is quite naive.
So now that Larijani has been taken out, this was the man who the United States would typically go to if Donald Trump was seeking an off-ramp. Now what happens?
Well, it's true that Larijani certainly was a figure in the political elite who had relationships with and was willing to talk to those in the West, whether it be in Europe or in Washington over the years. It does create kind of a vacuum for those in the regime who have that experience and who would even consider approaching discussions in the West. So it really does limit the potential for off-ramps or exit ramps from the war through some kind of diplomatic negotiated process. Although there are still others in the regime who have some of that experience, and you do still have figures like the president, like the foreign minister, who are still, at least for the moment, not on the target list. We will have to wait and see
not on the target list that we know of, but who knows, that may also change. But I wanted to ask you about the IRGC, because this is the Israelis can try and knock off different members within the Islamic Republic, but the IRGC is a vast network. They have a lot of money. They have been smuggling. This structure is not going to crumble overnight, is it?
No, it's not. I think the way in which this campaign has been prosecuted from the air is to try and degrade the capabilities of the security establishment, targeting bases, targeting missile depots, targeting launches, targeting infrastructure, to try and choke off the kinds of levers that you just talked about. That does not occur overnight, but it is a slow erosion and degradation of those capabilities.
The director of national intelligence posted a statement on X saying that it's Donald Trump who determines what's an imminent threat and what isn't for the United States. Is Tulsi Gabbard effectively washing her hands clean of this war?
Well, I think I agree with that statement. I mean, at the end of the day, the commander-in-chief is responsible for sending U.S. forces into harm's way. The responsibility for this war rests with President Trump, and whether or not he took the counsel of either his director of national intelligence or anyone else is part of that equation. But at the end of the day, he's the one who makes the decision.
Elisa, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us on the program today. Elisa Catalano Ewers there.